The dungeon was a place few dared to speak of and fewer still dared to venture into. It was whispered among the villagers that the place had a life of its own, breathing despair and exhaling terror. Hidden deep within the dense forest, the dungeon's entrance was nothing more than a jagged maw carved into the side of an ancient, crumbling mountain. Ivy crept along the stone, as if nature itself sought to strangle the cursed opening and seal away what lay within. Elise had always been drawn to the mysteries others avoided. The stories of the dungeon, a place where cries echoed and shadows danced without form, only fueled her curiosity. She had spent years training herself in combat and survival, all to face the forbidden depths. She wasn't naive. She knew the dangers, the rumors of those who had entered and never returned. But something compelled her. It wasn't just a sense of adventure. It was as though the dungeon called to her, whispering her name on the wind. The villagers tried to dissuade her. Old women spat on the ground, muttering prayers as she passed. Men shook their heads, avoiding her gaze, and children's laughter would halt when she came near. The dungeon changes people, they said. If you're lucky, it will kill you. If not, it will take you. Elise's resolve only hardened. She would uncover the truth and return to prove them wrong. The night she left, the moon hung low and heavy, its pale light barely illuminating the path through the forest. Each step felt like a descent into another world. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves were absent. The silence pressed against her like a physical weight, and the shadows seemed to shift in her periphery, always just out of sight. When Elise reached the entrance, she paused. The air here was different, thick and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang. The stone around the entrance was cold to the touch, and as she stepped inside, she felt as though she were crossing an invisible threshold, leaving the world she knew behind. The dungeon was a labyrinth of twisting corridors and cavernous chambers. The walls were slick with moisture, and the air was damp and musty. Her torch cast flickering light, creating the illusion of movement in the shadows. She moved carefully, her blade drawn, every sense heightened. Time seemed to stretch and blur. Hours felt like days, and she began to lose track of how far she had gone. The dungeon's layout seemed to shift when she wasn't looking, corridors appearing where there had been walls, and passages collapsing into dead ends. Elise wasn't alone. First, she thought it was just her imagination. The soft scuff of footsteps, the faint rustle of fabric, the barely audible whisper of breath. But then she saw them, figures in the darkness, their forms indistinct. They moved like shadows given life, flickering at the edges of her vision. When she turned to confront them, they were gone. But she could feel their eyes on her, unblinking and cold. The first true encounter came without warning. A figure lunged from the shadows, humanoid in shape but twisted and wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face, if it could be called that, was a blank expanse, save for a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. Elise barely had time to react, raising her blade as it attacked. The fight was brutal and brief, her training the only thing that saved her. When the creature fell, it dissolved into a pool of black ichor, leaving no trace of its existence. Shaken but undeterred, Elise pressed on. The deeper she went, the stranger the dungeon became. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light, and the air grew colder. She found remnants of those who had come before her. Rusted weapons, scraps of clothing, even bones. But what chilled her most were the carvings on the walls. They depicted scenes of torment and transformation, of humans twisted into monstrous shapes, their faces frozen in silent screams. The carvings seemed almost alive, their details shifting when she wasn't looking. Then she found him. He was hunched in the corner of a large chamber, his back to her. At first, she thought he was just another victim, another unfortunate soul who had perished in the dungeon. But as she approached, he moved, turning to face her. He was human, or at least he had been. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and his skin was pale and marked with strange, intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift. His clothes were tattered, barely clinging to his gaunt frame. Despite his appearance, there was an aura of power about him, a sense of something otherworldly. "You should not be here," he said, his voice low and hoarse, as though unused for years. Elise raised her blade, keeping her distance. "Who are you?" He chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "I was like you once, brave, foolish, curious. The dungeon, it has a way of changing people. I tried to resist, but in the end, it claimed me." "What are you?" she demanded. "A prisoner," he replied. "A guardian. A warning." She didn't lower her weapon. "Why are you here?" He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts pity and regret. "Because someone must be. The dungeon, it is alive. Feeds on fear, on pain, on despair. Those who enter become part of it one way or another. I am its herald, its lure. It lets me keep a fragment of what I was, so that I can bring others to it." Elise's grip tightened on her sword. "I won't let it take me. You already belong to it," he said softly. "The moment you stepped inside, it marked you. It's only a matter of time." She refused to accept that. She had come too far, sacrificed too much. There had to be a way out, a way to defeat the dungeon and escape its grasp. She demanded he tell her how to destroy it, how to break its hold. He hesitated, his glowing eyes studying her. "There is a way," he admitted, "but it comes at a cost. The dungeon's heart lies at its core, deep within. If you destroy it, you may break its power. But doing so will awaken it fully. It will fight you, and if you fail, it will consume you completely. You will cease to exist, even as a memory." Elise nodded, her determination unwavering. She had faced death before and was prepared to do so again. She pressed him for directions, and reluctantly he guided her. The path was treacherous, filled with traps and more of the twisted creatures. Each encounter left her more battered, more exhausted, but she refused to stop. The carvings on the walls grew more disturbing, depicting scenes of her own journey, as though the dungeon were watching and chronicling her every move. When she finally reached the heart, she understood why it was called such. The chamber was vast, its walls pulsing with a crimson light that seemed to emanate from a massive, organic structure in the center. It looked like a beating heart, its surface slick and pulsating. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the sound of its rhythmic throbbing was deafening. Elise didn't hesitate. She plunged her blade into the heart with all her strength. The dungeon reacted instantly, the walls trembling and splitting open to reveal countless eyes, mouths, and tendrils. The ground heaved beneath her feet, and an ear-splitting scream filled the chamber, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The fight was beyond anything she had ever faced. The dungeon's tendrils lashed out at her, its mouth snapping and gnashing. Her blade glowed with an otherworldly light, a gift from the dungeon's herald, who had given her one last chance before disappearing into the shadows. She fought with every ounce of strength she had, her movements a blur as she dodged and struck. In the end, it was her will that triumphed. With a final, desperate strike, she drove her blade into the heart's core. The dungeon let out one last, agonized scream before collapsing in on itself. The chamber disintegrated, the walls crumbling into dust. Elise was engulfed in darkness, a sensation of falling overwhelming her. When she awoke, she was outside the dungeon, lying on the forest floor. The entrance was gone, replaced by solid rock. The air was fresh and clean, and the oppressive silence had lifted. She felt different, as though a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted. But when she looked at her hands, she saw faint, shifting patterns etched into her skin, a reminder of what she had faced. Elise returned to the village, her story met with disbelief and awe. The dungeon's curse was broken, but she knew she would never be the same. The dungeon had left its mark on her, and though she had escaped, a part of her would always belong to the darkness.